welcome to the
I watched the Russian.
my opinion, one Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Signal Horizon podcast. It's a great pleasure for me that today I can introduce you to Garett Jones. Professor Jones works at George Mason University and he's an economist. However, before I think this is going to be a dry conversation about economics, I would like to say that Professor Jones moved into areas that are particularly interesting for those of us who are into politics. He has written about the effect of IQ, about cognitive issues, and most recently in his book, The Culture Transplant, how migrants make the economies they move to a lot like the ones they left. He also now talks very interestingly and writes about the matter of migration, which of course, these days is on everybody's mind. Professor Jones, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, glad to be here, Ralph.
So I have to ask you, of all your work, how did it happen that you now started also to write about migration, and what are your main conclusions?
Well, basically, I've always been interested in why some nations are richer than others. And we all know that there are a lot of correlations between various traits. One of the ones I always teach my students is that countries further from the equator seem to be richer. So is there a polar theory of prosperity, right? I say that jokingly to get there as a sort of intuition engine to think about, like, why are some places richer than others? We have these stories about capitalism and whatnot. But what migration offers us is a sort of natural experiment, because a lot of people have moved around the world, sometimes voluntarily, all too often involuntarily. And that's given us a chance to separate the importance of place from the importance of people. And it looks like basically people matter more than places. When you move Western Europeans just about anywhere in the world in large numbers, those countries tend to be pretty rich. When you move people from East Asia, especially China, all throughout Southeast Asia, those places tend to wind up pretty rich. So it's kind of it gives us a chance to do what economists like to do, which is look at things that are like experiments to answer big questions.
I mean, what you have collected in this book is a tremendous body of empirical work, and that really makes it so interesting to read, because which is what most scientists should do. You don't take sides in the political debate. You say, look, this is the data, this is what you know, this is where the evidence points us, and do with this what you want, so to speak. Now, when you did the research and were compiling all of this, what surprised you the most? What did you find the most counterintuitive result or finding that you discovered?
I think it was interesting to find out that the idea of diversity per se being a huge problem is not as strong as people think. A lot of what people call problems of diversity are really problems of changes in skill level, changes in the average skill level. So, for instance, you might look at like a professional basketball team and say, okay, if we added a lot of young people, if we added a lot of fourth graders to a professional basketball team, that team would get worse. But the reason it would get worse is not because their age diversity increased, even though it is true that their age diversity is increasing. You're going from a bunch of 30-year-olds to a bunch of fourth graders and a bunch of 30-year-olds together. Yes, that increases age diversity, but it's not the diversity per se that it's the problem. It's that the skill level dropped. So there is some evidence that ethnic conflict, religious conflict, conflict over values can create problems in a country, but those seem to be much smaller than basically big changes in things that are proxies for average skill level. So I want people to not get, I don't want people to get confused the way I originally was about the difference between problems caused by diversity per se versus problems caused by reduced average skill levels in a country.
Do you think that this is a major problem generally in the way we talk about migration? Like in everywhere where it's now so politically salient, there is this very general term of migration. But of course, there's a difference, as you describe in your book, who migrates where and what background those people have. And one of the things that, especially in the earlier parts of your book, you have an interesting focus on is this differentiation between low trust and high trust societies. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this? What does this mean? And what do we even mean by the term trust? So in a way that maybe those of us who don't have academic training also understand what is meant by it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of economics is about doing what we call looking under the lamppost. You know, there's an old joke economists tell that there's a drunk guy is looking for his keys under a lamppost. Another guy comes along and says, hey, can I help you? And they search for a while and don't find the keys. And the guy who comes to help says, so we aren't finding the keys. Why not? Why don't we find them? And the drunk guy says, well, I lost them over there. away from the light, but the light's better right here. So a lot of academic research is about looking where people have studied, right? And so it turns out that this question about whether people trust strangers generally has been asked a lot. And people in sociology and political science and econ, they've all asked it. So this is a case where the academic tires have been kicked on this by a bunch of different folks. And so here's the question that's been asked in a lot of surveys with only slight changes in variation. Do you generally trust other people, or do you think in general you can't be too careful in dealing with other people? And usually that's treated as a 1-0, yes, no, trust, don't trust question. Sometimes it's a little bit of a 1 through 7 ranking. By basically asking people, can you trust strangers more generally, is a good predictor of whether you have a high social capital society, whether people in general can engage in a lot of transactions with strangers where they don't have to do a bunch of double checking. In some countries, you think, well, I just can't trust other people, which is totally reasonable because most people are terrible, right? So it's actually a miracle that in some countries you can trust strangers. You can go into a pharmacy and just buy a bottle of medicine off the shelf and say, yes, I'm going to put this in my child's mouth. That's a real rare miracle to be able to do that. And I travel around the world a fair amount. And when I do, one of the things I like to check is, in this country, can you trust the brands that are on products? Or is basically fraud a huge problem? And in some countries, it is a huge problem. In some countries, if it says it's Coke, it's Coke. In other countries, you're like, is that really Coke? So this turns out to be a social trust. And more importantly, what's behind it? Social trustworthiness is a key lubricant of smooth social interactions. But more importantly, to an economist like me, what's important is that it's a signal of the ability to take on high value transactions without having a bunch of lawyers around, without having to have threats that will, if you betray me, I'll kill your family for the next 2 generations. People could just get along and take it for granted that things are probably going to work out. That helps people take on a lot of big deals and big financial deals and helps grow an economy. There's a big literature showing that it does seem to predict good outcomes, both at the micro level in the laboratory and at the macro level, high investment, high rates of, say, stock ownership, things like that. So this question of can you trust others, can you trust strangers, turns out to be a pretty good predictor of good social outcomes, partly because it's a signal that you're in a society where other people are pretty trustworthy.
Do we have any idea where social capital is coming from? You used the term miracle, and I think that this is probably quite fitting. So we know there are high trust societies, there are low trust societies, but what theories, what hints do we have where social capital comes from and how it can be preserved, or what are threats to it?
One simple version, this is sort of me looking under my own personal lamppost, is IQ. Intelligent people, intelligence does tend to predict trusting and trustworthy behavior in different ways in the lab. And I think part of that is because smart people have a sense that they can detect untrustworthiness enough, they can detect betrayal enough that they're like, yeah, things kind of work out for me. And people who aren't as smart are, internet memes to the contrary, often aware that they just aren't that smart. They're often aware, I'm getting tricked a lot, and so I shouldn't trust people. So one simple place to look for it, I would say just as a sort of beginning to a big debate, is that smarter people on average both are more trusting and more trustworthy because they think they can detect and punish betrayers more easily. Less intelligent people, fortunately, take their lack of intelligence into account and say, I'm probably going to get screwed on this. I better steer clear of this stuff.
Do you think there's a chance that is it trust that follows intelligence, or is it also possible that intelligence follows trust? Meaning that once you have a society that has a lot of social capital, a high trust societies where there is a very strong presence of this lubricant for social interaction, that this helps create institutions that then foster, have a positive impact on the average IQ or intelligence capabilities of the population, or is it the other way around, or is it a little bit of both?
I really think it's got to be a little bit of both, maybe a lot of both. So one simple example of this is that when people do cross-country comparisons of different test scores, not IQ per se, but like math, science, literacy test scores, it turns out that the U.S., which is a pretty high IQ country, but not the highest, has very high test scores for Asians, for people of Asian descent, second, third, and generation, and high test scores for people of African descent. So this is something where U.S. high quality institutions, which are partly, I think, due to the intelligence of Americans, help build good education systems where teachers show up to work every day and where teachers feel like they are responsible for doing a good job in the classroom. And so they teach more. Like educational outcomes in poor countries are often just really, really weak, partly because the teachers just don't show up. Partly because the teachers sell the books because they don't make enough money off their salaries. So there are a lot of reasons to think that that reverse causation story is definitely true. There is, of course, so much circular causation here. Part of the fun of being an economist is that we take these little chains very seriously. Sociologists perhaps are better at saying, maybe it's all just really connected, which is true, but often you want to break down the causal chains a little more.
Has this always been an issue you were interested in, or was it also motivated by all the kind of political polarization around the topic of migration that you said, okay, I want to take a clear look at this and see what's going on?
Well, I started off with this work with my book Hive Mind, which pulled together my research into IQ spillovers, why being around smart people is more important than being smart yourself. So that Hive Mind book summed up a decade of research. And I thought that was maybe the end of my discussion. And it has a little bit about migration in there. I thought that might be the end of it. But around that time, I noticed that there was this literature where Alberto Alesina of Harvard, rest in peace, he was one person who had started doing some research on using migration as an experiment to see if values migrated with the migrants. And there was some other work by other researchers in the same period. And I thought, like, this stuff needs to be known by the masses. And it was not known by the masses. I kept waiting for someone to write the book that explains all this to the masses. And then eventually I said, nobody else is going to do it. I got to do it. And so that's really what the culture transplant is. It's it fulfills my desire to make sure that some ideas break out of containment. Some great ideas in econ just stick in the journals, never make it out to the masses. My job was to take this stuff to the masses.
I mean, it's a really fascinating read. And I was wondering, I mean, our viewers and listeners know that both our platform and myself as well, we have somewhat, let's call it conservative leanings. And I do admit that a lot of the things I read in your book were, and we try to be aware of our biases and avoid too much of confirmation bias. But there were very often moments when I read it and say, yeah, this is so central to the ongoing current debate, right, of those who are, or at least trying to be objectively critical, for example, in Europe of mass migration, that it is not as easy as one would think that you can shed the behaviors, the kind of cultural burden or baggage, I think is a better term, from the place that you came from. It's a little bit of almost I don't want to say vindication, but it's have you ever been afraid, to put it this way, that your book could be abused by people with a political motivation?
You know, you always wonder if it will be, right? And I'm sure there have been some tweets out there where somebody overstates my case. I've probably seen a couple. But generally people, I'm really happy that when at least prominent people online have shared my stuff, they share it fairly. And they're like, here's the facts, just setting the facts out there. You do always wonder, you're right, that maybe the worst people in the world will start taking this stuff up. But I think fortunately, the worst people in the world so far, at least in the last decade, often haven't been that great at social science. So, anything that looks too quantitative sort of scares them off or whatever. Maybe I'm being a little glib there. It can always change, right? But I start off the book in a way that is a little disarming to people because I talk about the first preface. The preface is just about a story about the benefits of migration. It's hypothetical, but it's a story saying, hey, look, places across Southeast Asia with a lot of Chinese migrants seem to do well. If I wanted to make some poor countries richer, maybe the way to do it is to have a bunch of people from China move in. And I use that to basically get people to sort of make people realize this is not an anti-migration book, right? That's part of what the story is. Partly it's to get them to think, hey, this is a book about experimental thinking, quasi-experimental thinking. But this isn't an anti-immigration book. It's about who migrates.
Would it be fair to say, as one of the main pillars of the book, and if one wants to summarize it in one sentence, that culture does matter, or would that be an exaggeration?
No, I think it's true. It's like culture migrates, And it matters, and we have been able to measure it for quite a long time. There are other economists who've done excellent work studying the economics of culture, leaving aside all the other great social scientists. Joseph Henrich of Harvard has done a lot of great work in this area, famous work about the weirdest people in the world. And some of that work has been with some of my colleagues at George Mason, actually, Jonathan Beauchamp and Jonathan Schultz. And but this idea of applying culture to the migration debates was a case where I think I'm the first academic to really do this in a clear, direct way. Yeah.
Is there a definition that you use when you talk about culture? Sometimes people immediately think about religion, or they think about maybe dietary habits. What would be a definition of culture that you are using, or what pictures, or what do you have in your mind when you use the term culture?
I say widely shared patterns of values and behaviors that are shared among a group that can identify itself, right? And this could be, one could say, using that, one could say women are different from men in certain ways. Women and men have different cultures, right? We could say that African Americans and European Americans have different cultures. We can say that Protestants and Catholics in Ireland have different cultures. It's a group that can identify itself easily. They think of themselves often as different folks, and they have different internal values, and those values show up in concrete behaviors.
Would it be fair to say that all religions are cultures, but not all cultures are religions?
Absolutely. Yeah. If I'd written this book back in the 1600s, the culture transplant story would have been about Protestants versus Catholics in Europe, right? I mean, that shows that you can have people who are very similar in a lot of ways, and yet they can have enormous cultural conflict that's quite deadly. That fortunately doesn't happen to be on the menu for most of the world right now, thank God. But it's certainly not that live in the West at the moment, and it could always come back. But there's more than one form of cultural diversity that people can fight over. Humans have been very creative at finding ways to fight over culture.
There's currently an ongoing debate in continental Europe and the UK that was triggered by a professor at King's College in London, by Professor David Betts. He's a professor of war studies, and he has written 2 pieces about the potential for civil unrest / civil war in Europe. Very interesting and very similar to your work. Like, he's very academic, very dry about it, so he's not a firebrand. He's not trying to generate clickbait. But I thought there's a little bit of an overlap, of course, between your work and his work, in the sense that as societies start to disintegrate along cultural lines, but all kinds of differences, the risk of clashes is also increasing, and he observed this particularly in Western Europe. Now, from your experience and your research, do you think there's even if you're not familiar with his work, but do you think there is something to this? Is the fear that some, in particular in Europe, have, that there can be unrest or disorder or chaos or outbreaks of spontaneous anarchy, that this is purely alarmist, or that risk can at least increase as societies get more diverse?
I know Western Europe, Europe in general, has found a lot of ways to fight over religion and cultural differences over the last few centuries. I won't be surprised if they find a new way to do that. There is something a little bit. The U.S. has been fortunate in this respect, right? And this is, I think, part of the reason why the culture transplant has really resonated more in Europe at this point than in the U.S., is because people can feel the culture transplant there more. There are multiple reasons for that, I think. Partly the U.S. has higher skilled migration. I think the distance is a bit of a filter. There could surely other reasons as well. It could be there are certain failings in European culture that make it hard for people to integrate. But it's always possible that there could be civil unrest. That said, I have to say that if people are bringing in folks who are going to if migrants are folks who are very likely to make your country better, like if you're doing, say, high-skilled migration, it may well be worth it to take that risk of ethnic conflict in order to get greater prosperity. I don't want to. It's something I say in the book, and it's something I truly believe. As an economist, I believe in trade-offs, and so I need to be blunt about those trade-offs. And so, if Europe's going to face the risk of ethnic conflict over immigration, I hope they do it over high-skilled immigration.
This is this very interesting part about this conversation that you started with your book, and I think that you so eloquently express that, especially at the beginning of your writing, that depending on who comes, the outcome can be that your country significantly improves, at least in terms of economics, for example, or that the opposite is taking the case. Have you received, and I'm just curious here, I don't want to put you into a corner, but have you received pushback on this issue? Do people say, oh, look at Professor Jones, like he's peddling a kind of racist theories of migration, bring in the hardworking Chinese, the cliche, and compared to the, I don't know, not so hardworking sub-Saharan people from sub-Saharan Africa, or has the evidence that you present been widely accepted?
I'd say there are a few activists, like people who are very active in the open borders movement, who have given some unfair representations of the work. But other than that, I'd say academically, people either stay quiet or they've been supportive. I've been very happy overall with the reception, especially considering how I knew it was going to be a tough book, right? So The Economist covered it this year as part of their new series on the new anti-immigration arguments. And they didn't like my book at all. They had to denigrate it somewhat. But they at least mentioned it. And I have to say that being part of the conversation is worth a lot. You're right. Some people are going to be unfair, but I developed a thick skin when I was doing IQ research, and I'm always happy to go back to being a busboy if that's what I have to do. I had a good job. I enjoyed being a busser at restaurants when I was much younger. I'm glad to go and do that again if academia doesn't work out.
But you have touched on many controversial issues in your writings, and so far appear to have remained quite unscathed compared, to Charles Murray and others who wrote about similar issues.
Well, I have to say, Charles Murray's had a very good career, right? He's widely cited. I know that bad things have happened to him that he shouldn't have had to go through. But he got his books reviewed in the New York Times, right? I think a lot of people who think about becoming public intellectuals are what economists would call loss averse. They're worried about any bad thing ever happening to them. Oh, what if someone writes a bad tweet about me online once? Come on. If you haven't had at least one vague death threat, have you even been trying as a public intellectual? So I have to say that this is a case where academics are probably selected for being kind of fearful and timid. You would hope that tenure would make people brave and bold, but instead, somehow the sociology selects for people who are quite cautious. It helps that I'm at George Mason University, but my earlier university, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, they were super supportive as well. I'd say academia has treated me very fairly, and I can't say I literally have no complaints because, maybe I'm just kind of a complaining guy. But I would encourage more academics to take what academics think of as reasonable career risks, especially if you're in a field like econ where your outside options are so good. I just kept telling myself, if I didn't literally have to go and become a busboy if things didn't work out, I could just go work on Wall Street, or I could go work in Hong Kong or Singapore doing some quantitative finance stuff. I know statistics. I go find a job. So fear is over. There's too much fear in academia.
One of the things that he also wrote about, and I always wanted to ask somebody who did research in this area, when it comes to both, average IQ levels and individual IQ levels, I'm always wondering if you have statistics, for example, let's say that the average IQ in a certain area, let's say, whether it's in Northern Europe or somewhere else, is higher than in another area. Do you sometimes wonder whether the research itself impacts how people behave? So what I mean by this is that you then have people that say, oh, I come from a high IQ area, so therefore I must be smart and I no longer have to put in the work. Whereas on the other hand, somebody can say, I come from a low IQ area, therefore I have a natural disadvantage and it's not my fault. So what's the point of doing the work in the first place when I have this quote unquote genetic or inherited disadvantage?
I'd say that's a case to think about the Pygmalion effect, what's known as the Pygmalion effect research. It's basically the idea that if you tell a school teacher that their kids are really smart in the class, will they make the kids smart? If you lie to a teacher and say, the kids in this class are really smart, they're all gifted, will that make the kids smart? And this has been checked, and it's just not true. Maybe there's a very small effect. So this Pygmalion effect, the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies being a central driver of this, is false. And secondarily, both my own research and I think just common sense in econ more generally is that, yes, your environment, your national environment has a huge effect on your possibility of outcomes. So the sort of most extreme individualist philosophies that say I can become anything no matter where I am, no. If you're born in North Korea, you're just kind of screwed, right? So unless you really are great at kissing up to the 100 generals. So a lot of our possibilities in life are, for better and worse, shaped by our environment. But what both labor econ and my own research backs up is that there's a huge amount of individual variation that is not correlated to IQ within a country. So within your country, your IQ is not most of your destiny for your individual economic outcomes within that country. But where you're born does have a big causal effect on how rich you're likely to be in life. And it would be nice to find ways to make more countries as rich as a place like Denmark or Sweden or Japan.
What is your take on IQ tests per se, or our ability to measure for IQ? Because I think Nicholas Nassim Taleb, he's very outspoken in his own way about the uselessness or the distrust. Let's put it this way. He speaks more bluntly than I do.
Yeah. He's called me a lot of names online, which is an honor. I take it as an honor. It's it would be understandable if I decided to put that on my tombstone. Insulted by Taleb.
Oh, right? Well, so what would you? What would you reply be to his criticisms regarding IQ?
No, that IQ does not predict that much at the individual level. It predicts enough to matter, right? It predicts certainly enough to matter. But it is one of the most robust individual predictors of outcomes known in all of psychology. So, it's the cleanest dirty shirt. To me, the most important thing to know about intelligence tests is that mental skills are positively correlated with each other. So people who are above average on math are usually above average on verbal. That's what's really important about intelligence, is that it basically is the jargon is a positive manifold or a G factor. But people who are above average in one area tend to be above average in other areas. People who are below average in one area tend to be below average in other areas. These skills kind of they're bundled together. They're bundled together. And that's what's really noticeable. It is a lot like chip speed of a computer, where the chip speed of a computer doesn't particularly drive the outcomes, the precise outcomes, but it shapes the ability to get the best possible outcomes, right? So it's not software. It's more like chip speed hardware. That's what we should think about intelligence as.
In the United States, based on the studies that are available, I think there's a very strong, at least when it comes to standardized tasks, a very strong difference in, Asian Americans tend to perform very well, white Americans slightly below them, and then African Americans or Hispanic Americans slightly below that. And what I'm wondering, and it goes very close to a question I asked you previously, there was in 2008, Barack Obama gave this very interesting speech where he said one of the problems that we have in our school system is that whenever a black kid is trying to be good at school, it's accused by its peers that it tries to act white, right? Getting good grades is trying to act white. And this brings me back to a question I had before. To what extent do you think that certain cultural groups create conditions where the talented members of that group, but those who potentially would be, whatever term we want to use, high IQ, or I'm very open to which particular phraseology you want to use, that then it's that you almost create a cultural blockade for individuals within those groups to reach their genetic potential, and of course then also their personal potential.
Yeah, so Roland Fryer, a great scholar who was at Harvard, he wrote a paper on this called Acting White, which tried in a variety of ways to get at this question of how your peers shape you. That's something that I'm a big fan in general of peer effects being a sort of small to moderate multiplier in people's outcomes. If you have a bunch of frugal friends around you, it seems like that probably makes you more frugal. One of my favorite little facts in hive mind is that according to one study, if one of your neighbors just won the lottery and bought a fancy car, you're more likely to get a fancy car. So the lottery is a sort of nice little natural experiment there. And so, our peers can shape us for good and ill. So, a lot of the people who are super into genetic explanations for outcomes want to tend to downplay that at times, the idea that our peers can shape us. And we know that there's certainly limits to how much peers can affect you. But finding peers who support you and who encourage you can be very useful. I mean, it's just a reminder that culture shapes our vocabulary for thinking about success and failure, right?
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm asking this is because many of those studies that you used for your book, The Culture Transplant, and which I can only highly recommend to all of you as listeners, it's a fantastic read, it's a fantastic book. One of the things that you describe is the difficulty, for example, for people that come from low trust societies to give up, let's say, those low trust attitudes, for lack of a better term. So my question is, could this be, because is there, how to put this, is there like a natural resistance to adapting to new cultural values? Or is it also that in modern Western societies, there is not enough pressure for assimilation that then over time, or maybe could more quickly turn them into high trust individuals? So what I'm getting at a little bit is, if you look at the American experiment, and there's a lot to criticize, and I don't want to be nostalgic, but overall I think it is fair to say that the United States had quite a successful story, again overall, in assimilation of a widely diverse population. But was that because there was also this pressure to assimilate into a specific culture, into also what you said, a specific language of success and failure, that then enabled people from cultures that had a lower trust background or had specific cultural baggage to alter or change their culture?
Yeah, this question of what is it that might explain more successful, not just assimilation, but conformity to better norms. Because we don't want people to conform to worse norms. Yeah. That's the paths to that, I think, are still underexplored. We have a lot of correlations. Well, here's one of my favorite little correlations. Basically, here's a story. Migrants from low trust southern Italy to high trust northern Italy tend to become pretty high trust, apparently. Migrants from high trust northern Italy to low trust southern Italy don't seem to really become low trust. So this is a case where the optimistic story seems to pan out to a substantial degree. I don't want to say it's a complete degree. And that's happening in Italy, which doesn't have any great no one would think like, oh, that's obviously the place where people do a great job, conforming to good norms. In the US, one question I would ask is, how much of this is sort of American pressure to conform versus sort of American openness and sort of general niceness, being willing to give people a fair shot 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 times. So because, learning a new culture is a little bit like learning a foreign language. And it's nice to be around people who kind of let you screw up a few times. So here I'm just offering my own personal opinions about where that might happen. But finding out whether an open environment versus a badgering environment is more useful at getting people to conform to good norms is something I wish I'd like to see tested in a lab and then checked in real life.
I mean, if you would advise a politician, let's say in the United States or in Europe, when it comes to migration, or if you would have 60 minutes with them, what would be some of the key points that your advice would include?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the easy one is high-skilled migration. You use mundane, boring measures of whether someone is high-skilled. It's, a lot of these can be faked at times, right? So it's, some skepticism of how to do it in a good way. SAT scores administered in a reliable environment could be some part of a points-based system. But also looking at where the person came from. Like the country of ancestry, I think, should perhaps be something like a third of the weight. Because we don't just care about migration for the first generation. We care about migration because of how that person's children and grandchildren and descendants might turn out. Because you're shaping a country permanently on average with migration. And so finding, whatever your proxy is going to be, it could be the GDP per capita in the country, it could be the rate of corruption in the country they come from. These things will be noisy indicators and not perfect, but bundling a few noisy indicators together is the economist's classic way of fixing problems with crummy measures. Take 3 or 4 measures, average them together, use that as part of your points-based system.
When we take this idea, do you think is it difficult to distinguish between whether some of these numbers then or some of these criteria are they the consequence of local and this is probably difficult to distinguish. Is it local institutions or is it culture? I'll give you one quick example. East Germany and West Germany, right? So one could probably say that East Germany or North Korea and South Korea. That North Korea is of course worse than South Korea. East Germany was in many ways worse than West Germany. But when people moved from East to West, usually it got a little bit worse over recent years, but usually they integrated fairly quickly because one of the reasons why they had why East Germany was doing worse than West Germany was not because the Germans were culturally so different in the East. It was just that they had an institutional setup that did not allow them. So how can we distinguish this? So is this something we should keep an eye on at least?
It would be nice, but it would be nice to find a way to address that issue. But I do want to point out that, like, fortunately, since the fall of communism, it's been decades now, and that very little of the world's poverty now is caused by institutional totalitarian communism. Like, the explanatory power of that particular variable is like down to 3 or 4 countries now, right? And so, like, I'm glad to carve out an exception for that if people want to do that. But, much more of the explanatory power, if you're just being crude, is distance from the equator, right? And so that brings us back to this thing like, why is it that? And that gets us back toward thinking about culture transplant stories, IQ type stories, deep persistent stories, where that persistence tends to migrate from one place to the next. So you're right, that's certainly an issue. But, I feel like part of my strength as an academic is just explaining half the story, giving a solution that works for half the cases, and then I let some other people come along and worry about the 2 or 3 exceptions to the rule.
Do you think that on the long run, it is a little bit the hope, but we still sometimes talk about the developing world. And by this, we assume that there is a path on which every country, every community is, and some are just further ahead. And I guess in the ideal world, the end of history world, sometime down the road, everybody will be like Sweden or Switzerland or Denmark, whatever your favorite pick is. Do you think that's a realistic hope? Or are there just some areas that whether it's by geographical means, by climate, by culture, by the combination of all of these factors, they just have a much stonier road towards development, and maybe we'll never fully get there? I mean, I know it's a pessimistic question.
Yeah, I'm more of the second category. If we're thinking about humans persisting more or less the way we have now, without dramatic innovations in medicine or artificial intelligence or robots doing all the work, if the world looks a lot like in the same range of variation that we've had since, say, 1960, where we kind of keep just adding more gadgets and a little more science to our knowledge, the pattern has been that countries on average around the world have tended to grow at about the same rate, whether they're rich or poor, over the last few decades, right? There have been a couple of great big exceptions. Southeast Asia, East Asia, India and China, with each over 1 billion people, so it matters a lot in terms of the total number of people. But overall, growth rates per country, per person, have followed pretty much a random walk. And so there actually hasn't been all that much convergence since, say, 1950, 1960. So that pessimistic story where there's going to continue to be a ratio of maybe 20x between the top 10% of countries and the bottom 10% of countries, that's a reasonable starting point for debate for the next 50 years, I'd say. I wish we had found a better way by now to close that gap, but I think that's the mainstream position in economics, that there isn't that much convergence in income per capita. There has been some convergence in values. Fortunately, there's been some convergence in lifespan, a lot of convergence. Health practices have migrated to poor countries. There's been more convergence in women's ability to vote and to choose their own lives. But when it comes to income per capita, and that matters a lot, there just hasn't been the convergence that a lot of economists had hoped for.
I mean, if I would play devil's advocate for a second, some people would now say, well, the reason why the convergence is not taking place because obviously the West or the global North is exploiting the global South.
Well, yeah, the problem with that is that you have to have a lot of exceptions to your conspiracy rule there, right? You have to explain, why did the conspiracy allow East Asia to get rich and Southeast Asia to get rich? And why is Botswana doing pretty well? And why are Chile and Argentina actually doing better than most people would think? There are all these weird exceptions to the rule, so eventually your theory just becomes a bundle of exceptions. It turns out that part of my story in the book is that not that much has changed on a per country basis not that much has changed in terms of technological sophistication around the world since about 1500, since Columbus, overturned the world's map, once you adjust for migration. The rich countries are overwhelmingly, aside from a few natural resource exceptions, a couple oddballs, countries that are rich are either Western Europe, East Asia, or offshoots of those countries, or places that are kind of geographically close to them, right? That's kind of it. That's the story. That's why the little quote in French that I begin with my book with is "Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose." The more things change, the more they stay the same once you adjust for migration.
Well, before I let you go, may I ask what you're currently working on? What kind of research or what publications we can hope for in the future?
Well, I got to present two pieces of research this year about links between genetics and economic outcomes. I gave a talk earlier this year about how voluntary embryo selection for more intelligent pairing embryos probably has socially big effects that would actually help the planet as a whole. And I was just using back of the envelope estimates from some projects that are in progress where embryo selection is becoming more sophisticated. And these back of the envelope estimates suggest that basically, even if there's only a small chance that a selected embryo turns out to be pretty smart, like a lot of smart people become scientists, and then they have patents and they become researchers, and that ends up adding to the global pool of knowledge, which is really valuable for the whole planet, not just the country that person comes from. So I'm really interested in that. And so I've been working on that actively lately. And I'm also planning next year, I plan to start working on a book called The Neoclassical Reality, about how the big ideas in economics really help people, and especially macroeconomics, help people to see the world in a better, clearer way. And they're really underappreciated. There have been a lot of great books about game theory and how game theory has a lot of cool tools that help you see the world better. I think macroeconomics has a lot of similarly great tools that deserve to be more widely appreciated.
One of the things, because this is a nice segue to my truly last question, but I think it opens it up so nicely. So lots of my more conservative leaning friends have held up your book and said, see, this is obviously now the proof that all our criticisms about migration were right. But you have, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you have in the past written quite favorably, if that's fair to say, about elites, for example. But usually the very same people that say to me, read Garett Jones, here's what he says. He said, yeah, but you also have to read the other things he's saying, and that does not necessarily align with your worldview so much. So maybe as a concluding remark, tell us a little bit about what you think about the elites and why we don't have to hate them.
No. It's that when we compare the elites to the next best alternative, which is the masses, the elites start looking pretty good. A lot of people who criticize the elites don't actually compare them to the actually existing masses in their country, right? And so when you compare those two, I'm glad to say the elites are imperfect. They screwed up. Like the elites caused the Great Depression in the United States, as far as we can tell. At least they made it great, and have made a lot of mistakes over time. But the masses are no great shakes either. And so when we compare the option of real elite rule to real rule by the masses, it having some important role, not a dominant role, but an important role for elites, doing things like running central banks or being in charge of setting long-term policy goals or being on to making important legal decisions. Those folks end up looking a lot better than the actually existing masses. I'm sure that your readers and the people who hold up my book, maybe they and their 5 best friends would end up being better than the current elites, but the chances of those people and their 5 best friends actually running the country are very, very small.
I mean, I can already tell. There will be comments. I can already predict them that say, "What is he saying? Is he saying that Keir Starmer and Friedrich Merz and Angela Merkel, that they were the best available option at the time?" And I have to ask you, is this what you're saying?
No, that's the thing. Is that that the question is not comparing them to your 5 favorite friends on Twitter. The alternative is comparing to the actually existing masses. I'm sure that, I sometimes say, all complaints about the elites are auditions for replacement elite.
Right?
Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I'm sure some people can be better than the current elites. I'm sure there are a lot of people. But the thing is, we need an actually practical social system for going from the current elites to some other group of elites that are going to run things. And when we start looking at that, we're like, I don't know if that's so great.
I think that's a great point, and I think you just, in a nutshell, described one of the major problems of right-wing movements. Is exactly as you said. They think you just replace the elite with whatever, but in fact, if you really want to do something, you have to replace it with another elite. So even as an anti-elitist, you need to have a soft spot for the replacement elites, then, if you will.
Yeah, you need to have people who know how to run the show and to get things done in a meeting and to execute over the course of multiple years. And that's a pretty hard thing to do, right? Anybody who's tried, I'm an academic. I don't have to run anything. So, but I feel for those people who actually have to do something like run a military, run a central bank, run a Department of Treasury for year in and year out.
Well, this was an exhilarating conversation, Professor Jones. I hope to have you on again in the future. There are multiple additional topics I would love to talk to you about. I let you go for now. It is Sunday. Thank you so much for your time. We'll put the descriptions and where people can find your books and your writings and your homepage at George Mason University. And I hope that we will talk again in the future. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Ralph. Pleasure to be here.